Welcome back to the virtual Lubar Center, or at least semi-virtual. Charles Franklin and I are in person here in the room, but nobody else is in the room. That's the reality of today sometimes. But we are here to tell you more about the poll release this week on national issues, largely focusing on the Supreme Court, but we'll also get into some other issues. We discussed in a posting that was issued on Wednesday, May 25th, a lot of the opinions on court issues, particularly Roe. But we're going to get back to that here and welcome again Professor Franklin. Let's go over the basics of this round of polling.
So this is our national survey. We interviewed 1,004 respondents from all 50 states. The interviews were done May 9th through the 19th, and the margin of error is about plus or minus 3.9 percentage points. The sample is selected randomly from postal addresses around the country and recruited to do interviews online, but you can only be randomly selected for an interview. This is not volunteers who just enjoy doing surveys for the fun of it, though. They are so much fun. And so that's our basic storyline. As Alan just said, we've already released a set of items that focus on the Supreme Court and the leaked opinion about overturning Roe versus Wade. So that release and all of the data are already available online at our website, law.marquette.edu/poll. But today we're going to turn to the more political side of the abortion issue, as well as look at some other political issues of interest nationally.
And by the political side of it, one of the questions that I think isn't asked too often is how much do people really care? How much is it a motivator in their political views?
Since this draft decision leaked, there's been so much discussion about whether abortion as an issue would change the dynamics of this year's election. And so in part, that's what we're looking at today. 40% of adults nationwide say that abortion is one of the most important issues for them. 39% say it's somewhat important, and 21% say not very or not at all important. I will combine those two because only 6% say not important at all. But you do see this variation between the 40% saying most important, almost the same, 39% somewhat, and then you drop off to this 21% not very or not at all important. So important for a little less than half of the voters.
And I think there's been a lot of speculation or just curiosity. Is this going to be a factor in the election outcomes this fall and going into 2024? Who cares more, Democrats, Republicans, independents?
We'll see that this is sort of a mixed picture about who cares more, but on partisan grounds, 48% of Democrats say it's one of the most important issues to them, and that falls all the way to 31% of Republicans who say it's one of the most important issues. Independents fall in the middle at 38%. And so here is the basis for Democrats being more energized on the abortion issue by a not small margin between them and Republicans.
And what do people say overall about what they like public policy to be on abortion?
Yeah, and this is where that question of who cares a lot about it also becomes a little more complicated, because knowing your party isn't in fact a perfect predictor of knowing your position on the abortion issue. Elected officials are awfully sharply divided by party on whether they're pro-abortion rights or want to limit abortion. But in the public at large, that's not as easy. Now, overall, for the whole adult public, 29% say abortion should be legal in all cases. 38% say it should be legal in most cases. Then 24 illegal in most cases, and 8% illegal in all cases. So if you look at those, you can see that there's a majority on the abortion right side. That 29 plus 38 is 67% favor all or mostly legal, and a minority oppose that. Though it's important to point out that there's also a majority of the two groups in the middle. The 38% mostly legal plus the 24% mostly illegal is also a little over 60% that's in the sort of middle ground on this question. And so it's easy to see majorities here, but important to realize that how you divide this issue up could produce a shifting majority. Excuse me. Back to that question of who sees abortion as one of the most important issues, we saw Democrats had an advantage over Republicans on that. But when we compare the two extremes here, of those who say abortion should be illegal in all cases, that's the group with the most concern about abortion. 67% of those folks say it's one of their most important issues. At the opposite extreme, 60% of those who say it should be legal in all circumstances say it's most important. But those two groups in the middle, the mostly legal or the mostly illegal, drop off a lot in the salience of this issue. Those who say most legal in most cases, only 24% say abortion is one of their most important issues. And of those who say illegal in most cases, only 32% say abortion is their top issue or one of their top issues. So back to that question of where does the majority lie? If the majority is in the middle, concern about abortion is not all that high. If you compare either the legal in all or illegal in all, there's a small advantage to the illegal in all in terms of importance of the issue. And if you compare the mostly legal with the mostly illegal, the mostly illegals are a little bit higher in concern about the issue, though both of those groups are pretty low compared to the two endpoints on this scale.
This shows up in a particularly interesting way among Republicans, that a little more divided opinion across the spectrum.
And I think this is one of the reasons when we said a minute ago that Republicans are less likely to rank it as their most important issue. It's because opinion among Republicans is a bit more divided than it is among Democrats. With Democrats, 87% say legal in all or most cases, and 75% of independents say legal in all or most. But among Republicans, it's 41% that say legal in all or most. That's a pretty substantial minority view among Republicans. It's for certain that there's a majority of Republicans that would limit abortion rights. 58% would say illegal in most or all cases among Republicans. But you can certainly see that there's more division over the issue among rank and file Republicans, and that seems to lead especially those Republicans who are pro-abortion rights seem to rank abortion as less important to them, maybe because they're not in tune with their party. And so you downplay an issue that you're not in line with your party on. But again, I think the takeaway from all of this that we've been talking about is the abortion issue certainly has the possibility of motivating certain groups of people, but it's too complicated to say, aha, this is the key to victory for one side or the other when opinions are as mixed and motivations are as complicated as what we're seeing here.
You put together the results on alternative policies for abortion, and again, a very complex picture.
Yeah. If Roe is struck down, as the draft leaked opinion suggests it will be, the consequence of this is to return abortion policy to state legislatures and governors around the country. And we've certainly seen some legislatures act quickly to try to change policy in their states with respect to abortion. And in that process over the last few months, we've seen a variety of limitations on abortion proposed. We've seen that voters are sensitive to what the nature of those limitations are. So I thought it would be worthwhile to go through a set of alternatives that different states are actively considering, or in some cases have already adopted, and see how public opinion changes as we go through that. So the question we asked is, and let me read you the question, here are some limits on when during pregnancy an abortion might be banned, except in cases of medical emergencies, that some states are considering. How much do you favor or oppose each of these proposals? We do include that except in cases of medical emergency. It's fair to say that some states are including that in their laws, some are not, but we wanted a consistent prompt here, so we included the medical emergency language. So here are the options we gave. Ban abortions at any time during pregnancy. 27% favor that, 72% opposed. Ban after 6 weeks. 34% favor, 65 opposed. This is in line with the Texas SB 8 law. Ban after 15 weeks, 50% in favor, 49% opposed. This is along the lines of Mississippi's ban in the case before the court right now that would ban abortions after 15 weeks, and 50-50 split on this. Ban off after 6 months, that's after the second trimester. 65% would favor a ban of those later term abortions or third trimester abortions. 35% oppose a ban there. And then flipping the question, have no restrictions at any time. Only 39% favor that, 60% oppose that. So I think what you can see is a substantial majority that is opposed to banning abortion prior to 15 weeks, an even split at 15, and then a growing majority willing to impose bans on abortions at 6 months or later. And so I think this is in keeping with, honestly, nearly 50 years of polling about abortion has always shown that the circumstances involved matter to people in what they're willing to restrict and what they're not. It's very small percentage of the public see this purely as a either or, either a complete right to an abortion or a complete ban on abortion. I think our data shows that. But more to the point, it shows that state legislatures and governors and candidates around the country now have a set of real policy choices that are in the legislatures or maybe in the legislators' hands. And this balance of public opinion and how it matters what your proposal is may affect what is adopted or what the public's reaction is when laws are adopted. And this makes the whole issue far more dynamic than it's been for the 50 years in which Roe v. Wade and subsequently the Casey decision provided a national standard for when and how you could limit abortion rights.
One of the things, I think this is a factual statement that's been already happening, particularly in regard to Texas, is that women are leaving to go to places where abortions are available, and some states are going to try to stop that, make it illegal to go elsewhere. What's the opinion on that?
And again, this is something that's being actively debated in a number of legislatures. One version of that proposal would make it illegal for a woman to travel out of state to obtain an abortion in another state where it is legal. On this question, only 22% of respondents favor that limitation on out-of-state travel for abortions. 78% are opposed to that. And yet we've seen some legislatures making moves in that direction. So I think this is a good example of where national public opinion stands. It's possible that in some states that opinion is quite different in the states that would be more aggressive on bans on abortion or bans on out-of-state travel. So we should be a little careful about applying the national numbers to individual states. But we also see an issue here of partisan divisions, and in parties that, or states that have one-party legislatures and governors, the tendency to move on abortion legislation that reflects the majority within that party that may not reflect the majority of the public at large. Another thing to be watching as this issue becomes so much more relevant for policymakers over the next year or two or three.
You did ask or put together the data on partisanship here.
Yeah.
This is from banning women
ban.
from going
Yeah.
to other states for abortions.
And there is a party gradient, though it's a majority opposed across the parties. Among Republicans, 32% favor that kind of travel ban, 68% are opposed. But with independents, it's 19 to 81, and with Democrats, 14 to 86. So there is a partisan gap there, but there is also a gradient with clearly a minority, but a bigger minority among Republicans. And again, these are nationwide data. This might be different if we were interviewing only respondents in some of the more conservative states in the country. Missouri is one that's talked about this kind of a ban, for example.
Let's look more broadly at political issues here. One of the things we keep an eye on, and politicians and their campaigns keep an eye on, is trying to tap into how enthusiastic voters are. What's your finding here?
You know, the easy answer to any political campaign is turnout, turnout, turnout. And so enthusiasm at this point in the race, we're in an election year, is a pretty good indicator of turnout among groups. Those most enthusiastic are more likely to vote. It's not surprising that enthusiasm is lower here in a midterm than it would be in a presidential year. But in our data, 37% say they're very enthusiastic to vote this year, 31 somewhat enthusiastic, 22 not very enthusiastic, and 10% not at all. But there's a substantial partisan gap here. 50% of Republicans say they're very enthusiastic this year. Only 34% of Democrats are. So that's a wide partisan gap in the highest level of enthusiasm. There's not much difference in the less enthusiastic. Slightly more Democrats are not enthusiastic also. But Republicans have a real advantage here. And those numbers I just gave you are for all adults in our sample. But when we break it down just for registered voters, it doesn't change very much, and the margin is still similar. 53% of registered to vote Republicans are very enthusiastic. It goes up to 39% among Democrats, but still a big, big party gap there. So from the point of view of Democrats facing these midterm elections, with a president who's more disapproval than approval and issues facing the country, and just the normal midterm national pressures against an incumbent party. You're seeing that here in these numbers.
Enthusiasm, you also looked at it, we also looked at it by tying it to the abortion issue.
Because one of the questions here is, can abortion be an issue that would motivate people not otherwise motivated? And there's a little bit of evidence for that among those who say abortion is one of their most important issues. 44% are very enthusiastic, Of those who say it's only somewhat important, it's 30%. And it's actually slightly higher, 35%, who say abortion's not at all important to them. And that's not much different between registered and adults. So I'll leave that comparison off. So there is some evidence that abortion as an issue might motivate more. When we shift to that question on policy that we were talking about, do you think abortion should be legal in all cases, legal in most, and so on? Those, and granted, it's 8% of the public that say it should be illegal in all cases, but those folks, 50% say they're very enthusiastic to vote. At the opposite end, those who say it should be legal in all cases, only 33% are very enthusiastic to vote. And in the two middle groups, 44% of those saying illegal in most are very enthusiastic. That drops by 11 points, only 33% of those saying legal in most cases. So here again, we see a partisan advantage to Republicans in enthusiasm. We do see some gap between those who say abortion is really important to them and those who don't. But when we look at the policies people support, it's the illegal in all or the illegal in most that are larger than the corresponding categories for legal. And so the presumption that those who are motivated to protect abortion rights will necessarily be the ones most motivated this fall, I think, has to contend with our data, which shows that's not the case, at least on this particular question.
The election that never ended, at least some people think so, the 2020 presidential race.
We still see the question of confidence in that election or doubt in that election and whether it was accurate. In our latest data, 57% say they're either very or somewhat confident that the election was accurately counted, but 43% say they're not very or not at all confident. And there actually has been a slight movement there. Confidence is down 3 points from 2 months ago, and lack of confidence or doubt is up 3. But those two numbers also fell 3 points each from 2 months before that, back in January. So there's not a sharp trend, but over the last 4 months, we have seen a total of a 6-point decline in those confident and a rise of about 6 points in those with doubts about the election. So in this sense, the ongoing controversy is still there. I think we might take note of the fact that a lot of states are having primaries this spring. And at least in Republican primaries, the issue of the election and the accuracy of that election is something that many Republican candidates have talked a lot about this spring. Perhaps that's part of something that's motivating this modest but detectable increase in doubt about the election, even though we're now in our second year past the counting of the votes.
It's so interesting that confidence has actually gone down a little bit. I don't know what's behind that.
Yeah, I think it would be easy to believe that the issue is fading in some sense, and it's not.
Yeah.
Now, whether my hypothesis this has something to do with the primary battles that are going on and candidates within, again, especially Republican primaries talking about this, maybe is boosting that doubt a little bit is worth, I think, paying some attention to. And how does that move over the course of the year, especially as we have nominees in some states who have led the charge in questioning or attempting to overturn the 2020 election. On the Democratic side, there's been tremendous amounts of discussion and rhetoric and even campaigning about protecting democracy. But I think in this case, it's the Republicans who doubt the election that have the advantage in motivation and enthusiasm to vote. And we actually do see that in our data. Among Republicans, and about a third of Republicans are confident in the election outcome. Only 36% of them say they're very confident. The majority of Republicans are not confident, and 55% of them say they're very enthusiastic to vote. So this is an advantage to the election doubters within the party, and makes some suggestion at least that in Republican primaries and perhaps in the November election, Republicans who have doubts about the election may be advantaged in turning out their supporters, though they could be paying a price among those fellow Republicans that aren't part of the election fraud story. That's a minority of the party, but it's an important part of the party when it comes to a general election in November. Conversely, if we look at Democrats and independents, those who are confident in the election outcome are only at 34% very enthusiastic about voting, well behind the doubtful Republicans. And when we look at the minority, but not a trivial minority of Democrats and independents who doubt the election, only 12% of them say they're enthusiastic about voting. So I do think we have an issue here that's maybe more motivating to one important majority of Republicans, but not apparently all that motivating among Democrats and independents who are confident in the election.
So going back to abortion as an aspect of this, in a kind of a generic election, not for president, since we're talking about 2022, one candidate supports abortion rights, one candidate opposes abortion.
Yeah.
How does that affect voters?
And it's likely that we will see campaigns this fall that provide exactly that difference on issues. 54% say they would support the candidate who favors keeping abortion legal. 31% would support the candidate who favors strictly limiting abortion. And 14% say abortion really wouldn't matter to them as an issue in this campaign. So here again, you see that majority that we see on some questions that are in favor of some set of abortion rights, maybe with some restrictions, but on balance in favor. But this does fly in the face of whether this is the most important issue for voters and whether it carries over, or as we saw a hint earlier, those opposed to abortion make it a bit more of a most important issue for them than some of those who are in favor. Complicated issue, have I said that before?
I'm gathering that, yes.
And unsurprisingly, there's a big party split on this as well, with Democrats and a majority of independents would favor the candidate protecting abortion rights or keeping abortion legal. But a quarter of Republicans say they would vote for that abortion rights candidate, while 58% of Republicans say they'd vote for the candidate seeking to limit abortions. And 17% of Republicans say it wouldn't be a voting issue for them, whereas only 7% of Democrats say it wouldn't be an issue for them. So here's another little cut of the data in which you can see a little Democratic advantage on this, whereas on the importance of the issue and importance of voting on it earlier, we saw maybe it was the pro-life people that had a little bit of an advantage on enthusiasm or salience of the issue.
President Biden, how's he doing in this poll?
Well,
again, to say this is a national sample, not a Wisconsin
right.
sample.
And his approval is still notably underwater and has slipped another 2 points from March. Excuse me, 42% approve of the job he's doing, 57 disapprove. That was 44-55 in March, and it was 46-53 in January. So a bit of a slippage over the winter and spring. That's down from 58% who approved back in July of last year. But we saw a pretty sharp drop to 48% in September last year. That was in the wake of the Afghanistan withdrawal,
Right, yeah.
and also as inflation was first becoming a public issue and people were noticing the uptick in inflation. So national polls and our national poll and state polls almost all see Biden starting to fall in that period from July to September of last year. And he stays down substantially underwater on this.
Nobody's all that popular. We asked a slightly different question than job approval is, do you have a favorable or an unfavorable opinion? We asked this for Joe Biden, but we also asked it for the three people mentioned most often as possible Republican nominees in 2024, namely Donald Trump, Mike Pence, and the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis.
Yeah. This is a case where I think you really truly can say the public is in a really grumpy mood, and they're grumpy with most people, or at least these four people that we've asked about, though when we've asked about others, they're often grumpy with them. So this is favorable or unfavorable with all four of them, let's cut to the chase, are more unfavorable than favorable by different margins. Biden is 40 to 55, favorable to unfavorable. Trump is 35 favorable, 61 unfavorable. Mike Pence, 25 favorable, 54 unfavorable. And Ron DeSantis, 24 favorable, 37 unfavorable. Those last two have non-negligible levels of haven't heard enough about them. Despite being vice president for 4 years, 21% say they don't have an opinion of Mike Pence. And Florida Governor DeSantis, 38% don't know enough to have, or say they haven't heard enough to have an opinion of him. I will say that those numbers are not unusual for governors who are well known in their state and well known to political junkies. But if they haven't started their presidential campaigns yet, it's not unusual to see these levels of don't know, whereas very few people lack an opinion of either Biden or former President Trump. But I think it is striking that 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat here are all underwater on favorability at this point.
Although within their own parties.
And part of the reason, maybe the biggest reason these days for all of them being underwater, is they're well-liked within the party, certainly among those that have an opinion of them in the party, but they're pretty bitterly disliked among the opposite party that has an opinion. So let me just give you the positive side of that. Biden is underwater on this, but 72% of Democrats are favorable to him. Donald Trump is underwater on this, but 75% of Republicans are favorable to him. Mike Pence, it's 49 among Republicans and 33 unfavorable among Republicans. That is maybe the warning sign to Pence that his tension with President Trump over the tallying of the Electoral College vote may in fact be demonstrably hurting him with Republican voters on this. And then Ron DeSantis, despite the relatively high don't know rate for him, among Republicans is 56 favorable, just 14 unfavorable. And so in that balance, I think you can see why DeSantis is getting so much buzz, is that while a lot of people still don't know him even within the GOP, his net favorable to unfavorable rating is very good with Republican voters. We'll see what happens. It's a long ways to the 2024 campaign and whatnot. But I do think we see overall a lot of grumpiness to all these candidates. None of them stand out as heroes to the American people, but all of them are at least relatively heroes within their own party.
Donald Trump has been using, as a strategy, endorsements. What do we find in, we're finding out something in the actual election results,
Yes.
but what are we finding out in this poll
Well,
about the potency of these endorsements.
We took the advantage of May being a month with a lot of primaries going around in the country, and a few states that had had them sooner, to ask people whether they happened to know whether Donald Trump had endorsed any of their candidates in their state for governor, Senate, House, or in some occasions other offices, like Secretary of State, for example. And whether they'd be more likely or less likely to vote for a candidate that Trump had endorsed. There's a pretty wide margin there, but it unsurprisingly splits dramatically based on party. So among Republicans, 49% say they'd be more likely to vote for a Trump-endorsed candidate, 11% less likely, but 40% of Republicans say Trump's endorsement wouldn't matter to them, which is, I think, sort of interesting given how well-liked he is within the party, that not quite half say it wouldn't matter to them is, I think, kind of notable. Independents are much more negative. Only 12% would be more likely and 41% less likely to vote for a Trump-endorsed candidate. And unsurprisingly, among Democrats, just 5% more likely and 87% less likely. Though only 8% of Democrats say Trump's endorsement wouldn't matter. But they're clearly using that as a negative endorsement for them, or a negative signal for them. It's interesting that over 70% in each party category say they actually don't know whether Trump has endorsed someone in their state or not. And that's about the same for Democrats and Republicans. 71% of Republicans don't know. 70% of Democrats don't know, so almost no difference there. And 80% of independents say they don't know if he's endorsed. And about 20%, 21% of Republicans, 22% of Republicans, 21% of Democrats say they believe Trump has endorsed someone in their state. So we were interested in whether this matches up with endorsement data, so we went to a website, ballotpedia.org, which has been tracking Trump's endorsements across the states. And we simply counted whether Trump had endorsed no one in the state. That turns out to be 14 states in the Ballotpedia data. He's endorsed one candidate in 11 states and two candidates in 13 states and three or more candidates in another 13 states. So kind of an even divide across the states in how much he's endorsed. And it turns out that people actually do receive the signal and are much more likely to say he's made an endorsement the more people he's endorsed there. So in those states where he's not endorsed anyone, as far as we know from this Ballotpedia data, only 4% of our respondents in those states said he had endorsed someone there, seemingly erroneously, but you know. And in the states where he'd made one endorsement, 9% said they were aware of an endorsement. But where he'd made two endorsements, that goes up to 16% saying he's endorsed someone. And in the states with three or more endorsements, it goes all the way up to 34% saying he's endorsed someone. And so it's far from perfect. People don't follow this night and day. And an awful lot of people, still over 60%, say that they don't know if he's endorsed. But it does show that where he's been more active in endorsing a number of candidates in a state, some of that message has come across to voters who are more likely to be aware of it than they would have been. Interestingly, though, if we look at Republicans who are somewhat inclined to accept Trump's endorsement and more likely to vote on it, we don't find any difference in the percent of them that say they're more likely to support a candidate if he's endorsed people in their state or if he's endorsed more people in the state. It's just really very flat, with a little over 50% saying they're more likely to vote for a Trump-endorsed candidate, whether he's endorsed no one in the state, one in the state, two in the state, or three or more in the state. So awareness of the endorsements really does depend on how actively he's supporting people. But the influence of that on Republican voters doesn't seem to be sensitive to whether he's particularly active in the state or not.
So the big picture.
I feel like I need to say, well, so that's my political sciencey message of the day. It may not be the most exciting thing outside of the hallowed halls of political science, but it makes me tingle all over to see whether messages matter or not.
You've done a poor job of hiding the fact that you're a political scientist.
Darn.
What's the big takeaways from all of this round of polling?
I think we can see the salience of abortion as an issue this time, but I think the biggest is just the caution to not believe that the abortion issue will mobilize primarily voters on one side of the issue or the other, or primarily partisans on one side or the other. It's a very mixed picture with somewhat different patterns across party compared to across position and preferences on abortion. And we also saw that, I think, sort of critical table that we talked through, that if legislatures now have the authority to ban abortions at various points during pregnancy, that public opinion varies a lot in support of when those limitations might go into effect. And as legislatures, if indeed the court hands them the authority to legislate in this area, they will face a more complicated picture in the public, both in what the public wants on these issues and how motivated different opinion groups are on that, and party groups. So I think there's really no substitute for seeing how this issue plays out over the rest of the election year as we get an official decision for the court. So we actually know whether they've gone with the draft opinion or something different. At that point, beginning in early July, this authority may move to the states, and candidates will inevitably be pushed hard to stake out clear positions on the issue during the fall. But some of those things will favor the more pro-choice candidates, and some will favor the more pro-life candidates. And it is a different world where legislatures and governors have the authority to sign laws on this after 50 years in which the Supreme Court has severely constrained their ability to adopt their rhetorical positions and turn that into law. So stay tuned. It'll be a very, very interesting year for politics and public opinion, and this issue that's been with us for 50 years and looks like it might be with us for 50 more.
And 5.5 months till elections, final elections. So plenty still to come.
Plenty still to come, as always.
And we'll keep polling about it.
We will.
All right. Professor Franklin, thank you for all your work on this and for taking part in these conversations. We'll be back fairly soon with more. Thank you all for tuning in to this, and I hope we've been able to shed some light on some complex but really pressing aspects of what's going on legally and politically in the country. So thanks for being with us.